Hello, everyone, and welcome to this fourth edition of our Campaign Lab academic series, where we have academics in the field of political campaigning talking about issues relevant to the progressive ecosystem that we exist to support. Today, we have Dr. Lee DeWitt. Lee is Assistant Professor of Psychology at the University of Cambridge, where his work focuses on the psychological predictors and of attitudes towards immigration, using data-driven techniques to understand the structure of political beliefs, psychological and cognitive characteristics of swing voters, and the perceptions of political bias. And today, Lee will be talking about a deeply related subject to that, and that is on the role of bias and deep listening and how we can sort of better convince people through these, keeping these important aspects in mind based on Lee's insights and findings. I do want to quickly mention that our next event will be on the 28th of May, where Campaign Lab member Leonard Metzen will be talking about he'll be talking about, gosh, I was involved in the project, email survey petition signing techniques. There we go, got that out. Over to you, Lee.
Okay, great. Just get my slides up.
Just a quick update on how we'll proceed. Lee will give the presentation, and then at the end, we'll wrap it up with questions and answers, which should take up the last half to 1/3 of this session. So please do put your questions in the chat as we go along, and Lee will answer them after his presentation. And just as a quick heads up to everyone, we are recording these sessions.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Douglas and Hannah, for inviting me to talk to you all today. I'm going to talk to you about some of our work, particularly focusing on people's perceptions of bias across the political spectrum, particularly people's perceptions of source dependency. So do you think that different sources are sort of sharing information or have common goals, and how does that influence the extent to which you are polarized, or the extent to which you update your beliefs? So I'll talk about some evidence we have in some of these areas, but I'm very concerned that political polarization is a real threat to democracy, particularly as we're trying to navigate challenges like climate change. So I'm also really interested in hearing your thoughts about what you think about this research and how you think it fits, because I think there's still a lot. I'll present some of the findings we do have in this, but there's a lot that we don't know, and I think it's really imperative that we have a good understanding of what's driving polarization in order to navigate it in a way that maintains the robustness of our democracies. Often like starting talks about the psychology of politics with this dress illusion. And this sort of exploded around 2015 in popularity. And it's a really interesting example of an illusion, because often with visual illusions, we see something that sort of isn't quite the way the world is or how we think it should be, but we see the same illusion. Whereas with the dress, what's interesting is that people see it differently. So some of you will see this as white and gold, and some of you would see this as black and blue. I'd be quite curious, actually, if you're able to put in the chat how you perceive the dress. Do you see it as black and blue, or do you see it as white and gold? So I see it as black. Cool, yeah, so sort of slight majority for black and blue, I think, but there's some people seeing it as white and gold in here. And I think this illustrates something really important about human psychology, that not only do we perceive this as different, but we're also kind of surprised, particularly if you see it as black and blue. It's probably quite surprising to you that someone else can see it as white and gold. And this illustrates an important feature of our psychology, that we often are assuming that we kind of all inhabit exactly the same reality, and our experiences of things are kind of the same, and we don't realize ways in which we differ from each other. And this is us differing on something as basic as color perception. And there's some interesting psychology about why we perceive this stress as different, and there are heuristics that your visual system is likely using that shape whether you see it as white or gold and black or blue. But interestingly, you won't know what those are. So, if you're in the white and gold camp, or if you're in the black and blue camp, you won't necessarily know why you're seeing the illusion that way. And you might be inclined to think there's something sort of wrong with people who are perceiving it differently to you. You might think that they're biased or flawed in their information processing in some way. And I think this is an important sort of provocation for realizing that if on the level of color perception we differ from each other, there's lots of other ways that we differ from each other that we won't necessarily be aware of, and we won't necessarily understand. And you could also make an argument that this has been accelerated, the sort of awareness of differences between people has also been accelerated with social media. And actually, the social media sharing of this stress was part of what made it so popular, is that people could easily share online that they could see this as different. And I think the online environment is particularly shaping how we respond to politics. And a particular feature of that I want to focus on is the inferences we make about what sources we think are biased or what sources we think are dependent, and how that influences our belief updating. Now, I think that we face a really challenging information environment. We're bombarded with lots of different sources who are making conflicting claims. And in this context, my collaborator and I, Jens Madsen, we wrote a paper last year, a short opinion paper in Trends in Cognitive Science, arguing that we thought as psychology is getting more applied to areas of public policy and political psychology, often the kind of first lesson people kind of take from psychology is maybe that people are a bit irrational or maybe a bit biased in their thinking. And we don't want to dispute that sometimes there are things in human cognition that sort of appear a bit biased or might be described usefully as irrational. But that actually, by and large, people are pretty reasonable at navigating the kind of information challenges they're exposed to, or the decision-making problems that they're exposed to. And we argue that across a lot of domains, actually, we should start with an assumption that people are being reasonable in how they're engaging with information. And that's really the perspective that I'm going to approach this talk in, that yes, there is this sort of polarization in our beliefs, and we're sort of disagreeing with each other on the other side, but that isn't necessarily evidence that we're being totally irrational or groupish, and that actually there are kind of quite reasonable or rational processes in how we deal with information sources that could actually generate polarization. And if we understand these processes better, we might be better able to communicate with people. Just after we published this paper, actually, a paper came out that I thought I feel sort of morally obliged to share with all campaigners at the moment, because I think it's a really fascinating finding. It's a paper by Thomas Costello, published in Science, where they tried to persuade people out of beliefs in conspiracy theories using AI. And they did this in a very particular way. They got the AI to ask people, why do you believe in that conspiracy theory? And then they went through several rounds of conversations with these people where the AI would find the most relevant information and data that was contradictory to that conspiracy theory. And they saw one of the largest reductions in conspiratorial thinking that we've seen in any experiment. And I think this is a good illustration that actually sometimes, it can be very idiosyncratic why someone holds the views that they hold, but it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily mean that people aren't open to evidence and persuasion. One way of thinking about this is, Kahneman's description of thinking fast and thinking slow. Hopefully, some of you might have read this book, and he sort of breaks down human cognition to say that, we have lots of fast and sort of rough heuristics of how we process information, but we can also think more slowly and more deliberatively. What I'm saying here is that, yes, there are things in human psychology that mean we can sort of process things in a sort of fast, lazy way that's quite biased, but we shouldn't assume that that is all of cognition. There are more slow, deliberative processes, and if we understand a little bit better how to engage with them, we might be able to have better political conversations. As I said, though, there are things which appear on the face of it a little bit more irrational. So we know, for example, that there's what psychologists call a mere exposure effect. If I just tell you the same information lots and lots of times, you're more likely to believe that it's true. And this is one of the reasons why, effective campaigns will often settle on, one figure or one statistic, and they will just keep repeating that statistic. And in a way, even when the other side tries to contradict that statistic, by repeating that statistic, you're sort of reinforcing the congruence with which people process it and sort of reinforcing that. So I'm not arguing there aren't things that are sort of, slightly less normatively rational in people's cognition. Another one we see a lot in the psychology literature is that people seem to be inclined to vote more for faces that are perceived to be more competent. This is actually from a lovely study in Switzerland, where they ask actually Swiss children, which of these two people who are actually political candidates in France, which of them would you like to be the captain of your boat? Which is quite an intuitive way of asking a child, which face sort of looks more competent. And using these judgments of which face looks more competent, you can guess who will win an election. So, quite superficial cues to how people appear do seem to, at least there's a lot of correlational evidence that they seem to be able to shape people's preferences. And there is more experimental evidence of that as well. So I'm not arguing there aren't sort of irrational processes, but I want to focus on some things that are maybe a bit more rational that might lead to polarization that we might be able to engage with. And one of the ways I like to think about this is with this duck-rabbit illusion. So, we've got sort of two opposing camps here. And I often like thinking about whether this is really a good metaphor for what's going on with political polarization. Is it the case that, there are sort of trivial differences between us, but because we're really groupish, because we really like belonging to a group, we really strongly identify with one group and we only believe what our group says, and we disagree with what the other group says in quite a sort of irrational, motivated process. I think there is an element of truth to that. I think to some extent we do like to belong and we do want our group to be the right group, and we might ignore contradictory evidence just to sort of maintain the simplicity of that conception that I'm on the right side and my group is the right group and the other group is the other group. But I think under the hood, there are some slightly more complicated things going on here, which you could maybe still talk about as sort of quite groupish processes, but they're a little bit more sophisticated than a simple sort of in-group, out-group dynamic. I'm going to talk about a few bits of data in relation to this from a polarization tracker that my lab helps coordinate in Cambridge for a communications agency called MHP. And they commissioned us to run this several years ago, collecting measures of people's polarization on issues and the extent to which they dislike each other. We do this with around 1,000 people every 6 months with a sample that's quite representative for UK politics and some basic demographics. I'm particularly interested here in tracking over time how polarized are people on particular issues. So these are the sort of 9 issues that we try and ask people about every wave, and we look at where people who identify as left-wing or right-wing stand on these issues. And then we also ask people if they identify on the left or the right, how much they dislike the other side, and we do that in various ways that I'll illustrate. Just looking at this data so far, so this looks at how polarized people are on a range of different issues. And you can see that there's not a huge amount of movement over time. So it's not like we are massively becoming more polarized on these issues since 2020. Although there are some issues that have become a little bit more polarizing. Interestingly, though, one of the largest movements that we see in the bottom left is whether the British economy is doing well. And interestingly here, one of the main movements we see in people's opinion here is not people becoming necessarily more polarized, but actually both people on the left and on the right recognizing that the economy was getting worse as we were going through a period of high inflation. And illustrate this to show that people are responsive to meaningful information. It's not just that they only listen to one side or the other side, where they can concretely see in their daily lived experience that prices are going up. That can update their beliefs in a way that isn't necessarily polarized. So later on in this presentation, I'm going to refer to the extent to which people are polarized on issues. And the way in which we calculate that is that we look across this range of issues and see how extreme are you to the left or how extreme are you to the right. So when I refer later how issue polarized people are, or different predictors predicting issue polarization, what we're looking at is how far apart people are in these beliefs on these different issues. As I said, we also track effective polarization, and it's important, I think, to differentiate between how much people disagree about particular issues and whether there's also this sort of more emotional sense of disliking the other side. And these are two key features of polarization. And as I said, we measure this in different ways. A very standard way of measuring this is what people refer to as feelings thermometers. So we say to people who are either, they identify as conservative supporters or as Labour supporters, and then we ask them to rate on a 10-point scale, how much do you like other conservative supporters, or how much do you like supporters of the Labour Party? And again, here you can see that there's quite a big gap in these like ratings. So people are much more likely to like their in-group and dislike their out-group.
So, yeah.
Interestingly, also, you see a little bit of a movement. And one of the, there's not much movement in this over the last couple of years. There's a little bit of movement between March and October in 2024, where I think conservative supporters started liking their own side a little bit more and started disliking Labour a little bit more. And also Labour started disliking Conservatives a little bit more, maybe out of recognition that, once you get into government, maybe it's not quite so easy as you might have thought. And that, now that Conservatives are out of government, there's maybe less reason to dislike them quite as much as when they were in government. So this is a very classic measure of polarization, that you look at how much people like their in-group and dislike their out-group. But I do want to illustrate also that we've been looking at polarization, particularly this affective side of polarization, across a range of different ways of categorizing people. And I probably want to illustrate this just to say that it's not necessarily all just about which group people identify with. There's more going on than just this sense of tribal groupishness, where you like your in-group and dislike your out-group. So in the last wave of this polarization tracker, we asked people to describe how much do they like, which group do they identify with, or which side of the debate do they identify with, and then how much do they like people on the same side as them or on the other side as them. So we did this based on people identifying as being left or right, leave or remain, conservative or Labour. Also, you'll see here, we asked people, are you anti-immigration or are you pro-immigration? And then how much do you like people who are anti-immigration, or how much do you like people who are pro-immigration? And actually what you can see here is that the effective polarization on this issue is actually larger than any effective polarization we see based on a party identity. So I think this is a good illustration that actually it's not just people's sort of group identity that is shaping their effective judgments in relation to who they like across the political spectrum. This is also something, I should say, a lot of this work was done with David Young, my postdoc, and we also published a paper just recently where we also showed that this effective polarization, this sort of disliking of other people, can also happen to a really salient degree within parties. This won't be surprising to those of you in the Labour Party, but it's sort of potentially surprising to the academic literature that we also asked supporters of the Labour Party how much they liked Starmer supporters or how much they liked Corbyn supporters. We did this a couple of years ago now. And again, we found that the effective judgments within the Labour Party, say people who liked Corbyn or liked Starmer, they disliked each other more than they would dislike moderate Conservatives. So again, polarization is not just simply a matter of disliking, of liking your in-group, certainly not just based on your party identity, and disliking your out-group. It is a bit more complicated than that. So one of the things we've been trying to do is understand what else might be going on in why people sort of update their beliefs towards one side of a political debate versus another, and whether that is just based on people's sort of tribal sense of identity, or whether there are sort of cognitive processes going on that are maybe a little bit more sophisticated than that. And we've been particularly focusing on measuring and understanding people's perception of bias. Now, there's a lot of work out in the wider literature on trust, and there's a lot of evidence also that whether you trust a source is important for whether you update your beliefs or not. So, during COVID, whether you trusted health authorities within a country or between countries was a big predictor in how much you complied with lockdown rules or whether you ended up getting a vaccination. We think within politics, it's important not just to think about trust, but bias, because you might think that a source is, not necessarily trustworthy, but bias is a little bit different than that. In that, if someone makes a claim that goes against what is in their interest, you might sometimes be more likely to pay attention to that. Why is someone arguing something that goes against their political bias? Whereas if someone is making claims that fit their political agenda, then that kind of gives you quite a logical reason to be quite skeptical of those claims. And in a way, it's perfectly rational that we have to develop priors for what kinds of sources we can trust and what kind of sources we might find biased. And as Fred sort of tried to point to with the dress, there's a proliferation now of where we might get information from. So we increasingly need to think not just how credible do we think any given piece of information is, but what do I think of the source of that information? Do I think that source is biased in some way? That is a perfectly rational thing for us to do. We'll often encounter information that we'll have to decide not to put effort engaging with because we think that the source of that information is biased. So we've been asking the people doing our polarization tracker this range of questions about the extent to which they think different political sources are biased or not. So these are literally the survey questions that we ask our participants. And then we look at the extent to which people's agreement with these questions predicts their issue polarization over time. And just to make this super clear, what we're arguing here is that you might be a member of the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, or you might think that you might be more inclined to think you trust Labour sources or Conservative sources. And you might start out, not necessarily knowing what you think about the state of the economy. So, you might be sort of somewhere, I don't necessarily know, I'm not an economist, I don't know what the state of the economy is, I'm unsure, I'm somewhere in the middle. And then imagine that I get, claims from two sources. I get claims from Jeremy Hunt that the economy is doing badly. I get claims from I've blanked on her name, Rachel Reeves. Yeah, claims from Rachel Reeves that the economy is doing well. And depending on who you think is biased as a source, you might be more likely to update your beliefs in one direction or another. And again, it's perfectly reasonable and rational that you'd have to have some idea as to which source you're going to think is more whether sources are biased or not. And so you can get belief polarization. You can get people moving in different directions in terms of what they believe, just based on which of these sources they think are biased. And we think that this can sort of help lead or sort of helps fuel a kind of polarization cycle where, you might think that, your beliefs might be slightly closer to one party or another or one faction. And so you hear people make claims that are consistent with what you believed previously. That might make you think that those sources are less biased. It might make you think the other side is more biased. So maybe you update your beliefs towards what that party is arguing. And then in turn, when that party makes claims, you then again update your beliefs about which side are biased. So we think that this, is not necessarily, the only factor in polarization, but it does help kind of fuel a sort of cycle of polarization. So as I said, we've been trying to use this to predict how polarized people are on different issues. And as a caveat, this is not the only predictor of polarization. We think this is one of a sort of complex, cocktail of different psychological processes and different social factors and information environment demands and of course, how elites use communication and engage. But certainly at a psychological level, when we compare this to other individual differences that might predict how polarized people are, what I'm illustrating in this graph here is a whole range of different things that we think might be predictors of how polarized people are, and then plotting that against the variance explained in how polarized people are on different issues. And if you just ask people to place themselves on the left-right scale, unsurprisingly, that predicts quite a lot about how polarized they are on different issues. So, in this graph, just to sort of illustrate that left-right self-placement, is a very big predictor of people's issue polarization. If we ask people which party they belong to and how closely they identify with that party, that's also a big predictor. Interestingly, if we ask people's intention to rejoin the European Union, that is also a really big predictor. But what we see as fourth down this list is what we've called this bias differential. And by bias differential, what we do is we calculate the difference between how unbiased do you think your side is and how biased do you think the other side is. So as I say, we don't necessarily think this is the only factor shaping polarization, but it is a pretty substantive one in terms of the variance that we can account for. And what we've done looking at the data is that we show that this is a big predictor of how polarized people are on issues at one given point in time. So within a sample of 1,000 people, we can show that this explains a lot of variance. What we also do is show that over time, if we measure people's perceptions of bias at one point in time and then look at their position on various issues at the next point in time, we can predict the increase in polarization over time by people's bias perceptions at the prior time. So both cross-sectionally and longitudinally, we can show that these perceptions of bias are able to predict people's belief updating. And we show that this is even the case when we control for other variables. So even if we control for people's party identity or their left-right self-placement, the measure of bias in and of itself is predicting variance in people's updating. I've included here a whole list of other things that we think are potentially important predictors, things like right-wing authoritarianism, and authority within moral foundation theory, something called social dominance orientation. And I do think these values and where people sit on these different value scales is very important. Also, I'm very, very happy to discuss that further in questions. We've been thinking about this perception of bias, and you might have priors for which side of a debate you think is more biased than another, and that's going to shape which direction you update in. We've been also thinking recently that actually information environments are sort of so complex now that it's not just whether you think one source is biased or not, but also the sort of interdependence between sources. And so, going back to this example where we might be seeing conflicting claims about the economy, maybe I have one source telling me the economy is doing well, another source telling me the economy is in trouble. And maybe there are multiple people making claims on either side of this debate. And we argue from a cognitive perspective that independent of how biased you think these sources are, actually, whether these sources are sharing information is in and of itself also something you should take into account in your belief updating. So if you learn that all of the people saying the economy are doing well have researched this independently and have come to this position independently of each other, you should update your beliefs more towards that group than if you learn that the other people saying the economy are doing badly have all just read one study and they're all just updating their beliefs because they've read this one study. And actually, this is a very classic idea in sort of philosophy of cognitive science, and is a key feature of why we try and have independent members of juries. That if we think we have multiple independent people, they're more likely to come to a valid conclusion. And in our paper on this, we also do some modeling work to show that if sources are truly independent of each other, the chances of them all being wrong increasingly get lower and lower and lower. Whereas if sources are all updating because they've read the same piece of information, there's a greater risk that one bit of information is just wrong, and so you should update less towards that side. So it's perfectly reasonable to update towards one side. And also, again, though, this is likely to be a cyclical process where, if you also hear that one side of a debate is all making claims that you think are wrong, one way of explaining that to yourself is that they must all be getting that information from the same source that's wrong. Like, why could they all have this flawed belief about the world? Oh, well, it's probably because they're all listening to GB News, or they're all reading the Daily Mail, or they're all reading the Guardian. So again, we think this is likely to be a cyclical process, but again, we think that this is an important one. So we've, as I said, we've done some sort of computational modeling to show in simulations how this should play out. We've also done some experiments to show that if we just manipulate the dependencies of sources in a sort of artificial neutral environment that isn't really about any existing political parties, we show people take into account these dependencies. But we also wanted to do is survey participants, and we've done this with our polarization tracker in the UK, and we've also done this in the US. And we asked people questions like, do people all get their information from the same sources about politics, or do they all get their information from different sources? And what we see is that if we ask people to identify as members of the Conservative Party or as members of the Labour Party, and then rate the independence or dependence of their side and the other side across this range of different ways of conceptualizing this, we see a really big difference. So there's a really big difference between how independent you think your side is and how dependent you think the other side is. There are some slight nuances on this. So you might notice that people who identify as conservatives don't necessarily think that Labour supporters all have the same background or the same experiences. But on most of these dimensions, and particularly, where do they get their information from? People think their side is getting their information sort of independently, and the other side is like dependent in where they're getting their information. And so, this is a large effect in and of its own right as a difference between parties. But we've also shown that this also predicts how polarized people are on particular issues. And again, we show that it predicts variance in how polarized people are on particular issues, even when controlling for the strength of their identity with one party. And we also decided to control here for effective polarization because we thought this question might just be a proxy for just kind of disliking the other side. If you dislike the other side, maybe you're just dehumanizing them generally, and you don't think they're independent of each other. So we were worried that maybe this is just a sort of generalized sort of effective judgment, or I don't like them, they're all like dependent in their thinking. When it doesn't seem to be just that. If we control for how much you dislike the other side, we again still see that how dependent you think the other side is predicting how extreme you are on different issues. So that's some of the evidence we currently have. I also wanted to so I'm coming towards wrapping up now, just touching upon some of the things we're trying to research next with these ideas and with these studies. As I said, with the perceptions of bias, we've tracked this sort of over time. We've shown this plays out longitudinally. With the perceptions of dependence, we still need to map out how this works over time. We particularly want to do this across different countries as well, because we think some countries have sort of healthier media ecosystems where there is less of a sense that there's dependence between sources, particularly when those sources are less owned by elites or not. And I think there's a large sense of sort of populist anti-elite sentiment out there that is relevant to these perceptions of dependence. We're trying to do more work as to what exactly triggers the perception that the other side is biased. And particularly, we really want to understand, is it just when you disagree on an issue, or is it when you disagree on the sort of values that shape why you have that position on that issue? We're happy to say a bit more about that if you're interested. One of the other things I really want to do next is try and look at how this influences science communications. One of the things that really worries me at the moment is that scientists might say something about climate change or about vaccines, and rather than be seen as an independent source that is just looking at the evidence objectively and coming to an independent perspective on that, scientists will increasingly be seen as just another political source. And I really want to research ways in which we can try and protect scientists from being seen as dependent on a particular agenda when they speak out independently based on evidence. Okay, final two slides now. I just want to sort of throw some questions back at you, or some sort of my thinking about how this might help or you think about your campaigning. I just caveat these are much more speculative. I don't have evidence per se for these claims. And this is one of the great reasons that Campaign Lab exists, and people like Hannah and Douglas can hopefully help coordinate research to test questions like this. So one impact, and focus on a couple of sort of potential insights that are more relevant to like you as an individual campaigner, and then some insights that might be more related to sort of like how you might structure a campaign or think about a campaign more systematically. So, when you're trying to persuade someone, on the doorstep that, maybe the Labour government is doing better, again, if they already think you're biased as a source, you're really at a disadvantage in trying to communicate anything, particularly when what you're trying to communicate is maybe something quite vague about the economy, where they're getting conflicting claims. And if they think you're biased already, there's no reason why they update towards you. But when something is really self-evident in people's lived experience, if there's something really concrete you can point to as to, look, your GP surgery down the road has cleared their waiting times. And when they talk to their friends, they'll be able to acknowledge like, oh yeah, I got a GP appointment the other day, it worked out really well. So if you can ground things in something that is concretely like verifiable in people's lived experience, this can cut through this dependence on what people are thinking about sources. I've heard some talk that Labour are sort of trying to focus on fixing potholes in people's roads, and I think that there's a validity to that, because every time you drive down the street, you're going to experience that pothole. Or when I cycle down the street, I can definitely feel those potholes, and that's something you'll really notice in your lived experience that doesn't require you to believe a particular source. I think trying to engage with their perspective. So, also as a campaigner, like when they say something you disagree with, like don't just assume their bias, like try and understand their perspective and why they've come to their view. And I think if you can share a bit of that perspective taking, that helps break down a little bit this idea that, they'll think you're biased and you'll think they're biased. Also, establishing common ground. So, if you disagree, you could try and find perspective as to why you disagree. But also, there's a lot of agreement between people on many issues. And we often, I've got evidence on this, and lots of other people have evidence on this, that we often have an exaggerated perception of the difference between groups, particularly in their support for different issues. And for something like immigration, as I said, this is a really salient, polarized topic. But often, when you ask slightly more nuanced questions about immigration, like whether you'd support people who are, high-skilled workers, for example, there's often a lot more agreement on particular questions than you might assume. So often you'll be able to find common ground with people in a way that means, they won't necessarily just assume that you are a biased source. Thinking a little bit more strategically, one of the things I worry about quite a lot, and I wonder if this is maybe, part of the culture of the sort of spin of political discourse that Alistair Campbell helped establish, is that, we're sort of meant to stick to the party line these days. And of course, some sense of like coordinated media communication is important, but I also think that somehow that probably feeds into this idea of like, oh, you're just saying that because that's what your party's telling you to say. You're just saying that because you're biased. So I think somehow, like strategically, we need to navigate this, having a consistent line as a party, but also actually being able to explain to people like why you've come to that position, rather than just them seeing that you're parroting like a party's position on something. I think as I said, I think there's a massive amount of anti-elite sentiment out there. There's massively something we see in our polarization tracker. There's lots of other data on this. And I think this is something political parties need to be super aware of. I think it's actually something that often, more extreme political figures can be very good at, and that will say really provocative things because it kind of signals they're not part of the established elite or the establishment status quo. And yeah, I think ensuring that your party doesn't get to be seen as just sort of dependent on elites. This is where I think the kind of donations that Keir Starmer received for some of his clothes was, I think, really unfortunate, because I think that that connected him in many people's minds as being dependent on elites in some way. My final slightly provocative point is to maybe be more like Martin Lewis. I think Martin Lewis for me is the sort of epitome of a sort of unbiased source. Like I think he really tries to show you his reasoning as to. So he's this economics advice guru, and I think he's often really good at just objectively walking you through like this is why this is better for your bottom line at the end of the day. And are really good at sort of establishing himself as an unbiased source that isn't just parroting one particular position or agenda. And I think it's going to be important for political campaigns to sort of engage with a wider range of influencers who you'll have to accept won't always agree with you, but actually in a way that's part of their utility, that they're not just going to be seen as like part of your party apparatus. But actually sort of engaging with them and getting them to understand, why you're taking certain positions on certain issues, they might then be able to explain that to their audiences in ways that would be, listened to more than you trying to say that yourself. I think I saw someone ask about sharing the slides in the chat. Very happy to do so, and some references to this work here. And again, I just will end with a little bit of a thanks to my collaborators, but particularly David Young, who's collaborated on a lot of this work, particularly the MHP polarization. Okay, thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Lee. questions. If you've got any questions, please write them up in the chat, or raise your hand and you can ask Lee yourself. Yes.
Henry has one in the chat.
Yes, Henry has a question. It's okay with you, Henry. I'm going to read it out. I have a genuine short psychological evaluation question. To what extent is Martin Lewis unbiased in comparison to economics enthusiast Gray's economics, in particular his politico-economic involvement on YouTube?
That's Gary's
I mean,
economics.
Yeah, sorry. I wouldn't really like to. I'm not an economist. I don't necessarily have a view on that. I think the broader point I was trying to make was that people differ in how whether they'll be perceived as bias, and different people will have different priors for which sources are biased. Which is again, I think, why sort of engaging with a range of influencers who are going to have bandwidth with different audiences is more the point I would want to make there.
I think also what you were saying, Lee, about being tied to a particular viewpoint maybe makes it less convincing to somebody who you're trying to persuade. So Gary's economics is very tied to a particular political viewpoint, therefore maybe less credible as a source to someone you're trying to persuade than, say, Martin Lewis, who has that kind of neutrality. So I think it's interesting, those two different groups. Great. I think there was another question there from Nathan. Which is, do you have a link to the study about AI interventions with conspiracy theory believers? So a link to that study. And then Matthew, you've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, thank you. Found that really interesting. I just had a question around, so it was really interesting, like the faces thing that you showed. And I just wondered, does that then give one question that went on the thread was which face did people trust more? But I just wondered, does it then make sense to think a lot about actually how politicians appear, how they dress, but also is there something more broader than that around Labour's, for example, thing where now they show the Union Jack in all their comms and stuff? Is that an effective ploy to almost try and show to people who may not be on the same side as you in terms of political persuasion that actually sort of we are one of you and we are the same tribe, and that actually means that your messages land with more resonance? To what extent does the academic research support that type of argument?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like an RCT with Keir with a flag in the background or not. But yeah, I think it probably is a sensible thing for them to do. I think there's quite a lot of people in the population who are sort of were skeptical about Labour's sort of patriotism as a party, and so trying to communicate that isn't necessarily, that isn't a value that they disagree on, might make it easier for Labour to get heard on a wider range of issues. And yeah, I think this point about looking competent. Again, I would emphasize that these are relatively small effects. I mean, where we see larger effects is where people have very little other information. So they've got very little else to go on. And then if you show them in an experiment like that, then quite superficial cues can be more influential. So in really high stakes elections that are really important, it's likely these more superficial cues are going to become less important. But they are still there, and they are still relevant. And in a way, appearing competent and trying to look the part as a politician, there is something about, particularly people on the right tend to care more about that sense of conscientiousness. It's maybe something people on the left don't intuitively care about as much, but sort of respecting the convention of just looking like a professional politician is potentially something that people on the right are going to particularly care about. As I said, though, I worry a little bit when people talk about the role of psychology in politics, that people try and jump on these little easy wins and think these little easy wins are gonna win them a campaign. And I think having a flag in the background and looking competent, they might be marginally helpful, but they're not going to win you a campaign. They're not a sort of more wide-ranging information strategy that thinks about how you communicate through people's perceptions of bias or people's perceptions of the dependency of sources. So I do want to emphasize that I think the lesson from psychology is not just that these superficial cues are going to get you the whole way, whilst at the same time don't ignore them.
Thank you.
Just who won on the who won on the faces? Like which person should lead the ship? I'm very curious.
I think it was the person. I think it was the person on the right in that one.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, we don't
Okay,
all
interesting.
think. So it is like on average, most people will think one is more competent, and on average, that person will get more votes.
Cool. Douglas,
Yeah,
you've
actually,
got your hand up.
Oh, sorry, Lee, I just want to let you finish your thought and then I'll ask my question.
yeah, actually, well, I wanted to pick up on Nathan's question about sort of race or gender, because actually, I think that's something Denise Barron, who did her PhD at the LSE, did a really interesting study on this, where they asked people which candidates they supported, and they told them like a little bit of information about each of the candidates, sort of with a sort of social media-like profile. And they manipulated like the gender and race of the politicians, and had a representative sample of the population. So had participants with different races and genders, and looked towards the extent people would vote for people who were like them. And what they found was that alignment on being the same race or the same gender was actually a really small effect. What was a really large effect is whether they shared the same values. So if the politician said something like, I think kids these days should learn more respect for traditional British values, that was much more likely to get them more support than if they were the same gender or race. And so I think we do definitely have like implicit biases for things like race, and we are more likely to think that people of different races. Some of us will have implicit biases that mean we think that some people of different races are less competent, and similarly on gender. But actually, in politics, I would really emphasize that like where people sit on values, I think, is a much bigger driver than some of those sort of more demographic characteristics.
Thank you, Lee. And I just have a quick question. I was wondering if you could just expand on the concept of empathy and the role that empathy plays in opening people's minds.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in a way that like these perceptions of bias and dependence can sort of be cognitive, heuristics to make it easier, not necessarily to engage with the other side as much. So, if you just think that someone's holding a belief because they're biased or because they're getting information from a particular source, then yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that's necessarily a very sort of empathetic response. That's something we debated quite a lot, by the way, in the paper I mentioned on the sort of opinion paper that behavioral public policy, so not just in relation to sort of politics, but how government approaches citizens more generally. That's something we debated quite a lot as to whether we thought we should sort of emphasize that civil servants should try and have more empathy in how they think about, why some people are behaving particular ways. So often, civil servants might be trying to get people to comply with a given process or turn up to appointments on time. And often when you really think through the barriers to that behavior, like it's often just that the target behavior is actually quite difficult for the person to engage in. Like there are like process things that you could just make a lot simpler and you'd get a lot more compliance with the behavior. So we debated quite a lot, like in that paper, should we talk about this as civil servants like should have more empathy? And we decided not to say that, because we thought, it's quite a, for us as scientists, it's sort of quite a normative position to take. So we more were just trying to encourage people to sort of think through more carefully the reasons why people would hold a belief, and be aware that you're likely to think that you're maybe likely to rely on you can sort of discount why people are not doing the thing you want them to do by thinking they're irrational, but it doesn't necessarily help you to get them to engage in their behavior. And I think you could think about that as having more empathy for them, but we kind of didn't want to take that normative position in that paper. But I think a perfectly legitimate way approach to take to that.
Great. So we've got two final questions in the chat, which I think we'll take, and then we'll kind of wrap up. So One is from Noam, which says, we have talked today as if polarization occurs naturally, and often it does. Often it is very intentionally engineered. For voter suppression or mobilization, polarization is often a key objective of certain campaigning activity. Do you have thoughts about the intentional engineering and exacerbation of polarization in campaigning? That's the first question. And the second is one from me, which is, I think everything you've said is quite interesting in terms of endorsements. So should we be encouraging when a campaign gets an endorsement from, say, somebody locally, that rather than them just being featured on our own literature that's Labour branded, maybe they should be sending out their own literature so you get kind of more variety of sources, just based on that kind of basic intuition that the more sources you have, the better. So those are just like, yeah, a couple to think about, and then we'll wrap up and launch a poll.
Yeah, these are really good questions. And one of the other things that we try and work on in our lab is sort of more objective quantifications of how polarized a given country is. And in our own data, we see that the US is a lot more polarized on various metrics than many other countries. And I think there's other data consistent with that as well. And I really hear your point about polarization being driven as a sort of strategic choice by certain actors. And yeah, so whilst I look at a lot of the psychology of this, so that's just the lens that I look at it through, I apologize if that means I've communicated that I think it's primarily being driven by that psychology. That's definitely not what I want to say. It's just that's, the way in which I try and investigate it. And I definitely think that there are, strategic forces at play. And I think particularly in the US, the role of campaign finance in elections. And I particularly suspect that the financing of candidates who were anti-taking action on climate change is a really big factor in having got like elites into the American political system who are just much more extreme in their beliefs and much more happy to argue towards extreme beliefs. So I definitely think there are like strategic factors at play that help like drive polarization. But I also think that it's really important that we do understand, some of the psychology of how that's going to play out, and we don't kind of make it worse by just assuming like, oh, the other side are just biased and irrational, and I just dislike them and I hate them and I won't try and communicate them with them. In a way, like the fact that there are strategic actors who are trying to maybe promote polarization or are benefiting from it, like I think reinforces why we need to engage really carefully with the psychology of it, and to try and think carefully about how we might depolarize it. Yeah, the point about not just working with other kind of local communicators and getting their face on your leaflet, but like getting them to communicate, directly themselves. That makes a lot of sense to me, that, them, putting their view independently in their own way of communicating that might be listened to more. I'm quite a fan of Gary's economics. I don't know if other people who are following this podcast are talking about inequality. And he recently ended up his podcast series saying, look, I can't be the only one making this argument. Like, don't just try and join forces with me, but like, thinks, you make this case yourself. You as an independent agent go out and make the case for this. And I think, yeah, I think we could probably more strategically think about like, how do we activate all the nodes who might be effective in communicating information in a network, rather than just like, how do we put all their faces on our leaflet? Because when our leaflet comes through the door, it is branded the Labour Party, like you're already not going to be listened to by a lot of people. Of course, if you do that in a way that's sort of quite Machiavellian, and you just tell someone like, okay, you're secretly in cahoots with the Labour Party, don't tell them that, but go and argue for our positions, but don't tell anyone you're a member. Like, people do not like being duped, and like do not like being misled. Like, that would be the worst thing to do. And so I think it's really important when you do that to like accept that you're going to lose a bit of control. So, you might activate a range of influencers who might have bandwidth with different audiences to you, but they might not always agree with you. And, you have to, I think that's the sort of trade-off you have to think about how to navigate.
Brill. We have one final question just from Colin there, which I think we've just about got time for, which is, does the breakdown of the two-party system imply that polarization is increasing? Just final thoughts.
It's a good question. I mean, that's sort of one of the reasons why we were interested as well in our polarization tracker, asking people about polarization on immigration per se, as opposed to in relation to a particular party. Because I think in the US, like the dominance of the two-party system often means that like political issues get like pulled into the parties in some way. And so it's often quite hard to differentiate like people really disagree on this issue, or are they just like tribally fighting for their party? And I think in the UK, like we've seen people move all over the place with which party they're voting for the last couple of years. This idea that you are really like tribally loyal to one party or another, and that is really what's driving all of your effective judgments. I don't think that really like captures a lot of what's going on in the UK. And that's why we particularly wanted to ask, like, if you are pro-immigration or anti-immigration, like, what do you think of people who hold the opposite view to you on that issue? Because I think polarization is much more complicated than just like liking your in-group party identity and disliking the out-group party identity. Like polarization, particularly its emotional side of polarization, can like manifest across lots of different issues.
Douglas, do you want to thank Lee? And I'll thank Lee now as well. And while Douglas is doing that, I'm just going to launch a little poll, which is really important for us to know whether to keep doing these things. So I will just launch that now. Douglas, thanks, Lee. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks, Lee. That was a great presentation and an issue that's certainly close to my heart as well. Next week will be next month on the 28th, we'll have our next session, and that'll be Leonard, who will be talking about how to reach out, how to do petitioning effectively, using email campaigns, and whether sort of tailored responses are going to be better than sort of more generic template responses. But yes, to reiterate, thank you, Lee. That was a great presentation. And we will put together a blog post about this, and we have recorded this event, which we'll see if we get around to posting online. But either way, read up the blog post after this. That should be out sometime early next week. And please share it with anyone who you feel will be interested. Thank you so much.
Brill. And
Thanks
if people can just fill in this poll, there is 12 out of 17. So please do finish the poll before you leave the call, because it allows us to know what's useful and what's not useful. So if people can just finish that poll. I think there's 3 of you left to do it. Cool. Okay. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Lee. I'll just end this poll. Great. Okay. Sorted. Okay, we'll end the call. Thanks, Lee, for doing that.
Pleasure. Happy to.